Hello, I'm Jessica, and this is my creative final project for the class Asia 223 South Asian Studies, taught by Lisa Balabanalar and Eric Huntington. And I'm doing a video essay on three fantasy/magical realism books that I read that relate to historical periods and topics that we've talked about in class. So I'm going to go through each of these books and give some of the context behind these books and the authors, a synopsis / what they're about, my personal thoughts, and also how they relate to class, and if I would recommend them to the people who also took the class or other people who might want to read them. So get cozy, get comfortable. I have my cup of tea because it's really hot in here, cold, and also because I'm a little sick, and I'm gonna get started. Okay, hello. So first of all, a couple disclaimers before we go into the rest of the video. For one, I don't know if you could already tell, but it is a different day, and I did film basically all of these on different days. So you'll just have to accept that while watching this video. And also, I've discovered that my phone can only record in 5-minute increments. So if some of this seems a little choppy, it's not because I'm bad at editing, it's because my phone hates me and is against the filming of this video. But with that being said, I'm going to go into the first book, which is Kaikeyi by Vaishnavi Patel. So this book was published in 2022, which is quite recently, and it became pretty popular over the internet, I think specifically over TikTok, and also in general, like book things. And the author Patel was born and raised in Chicago and is currently a law student, so she's still pretty young. And as for a synopsis of the book, it follows the titular character Kaikeyi, who is a figure in the Ramayana. She's the stepmother of Rama and is the one who banishes him, which kind of starts off a lot of the events of the Ramayana. But this book reimagines her life, starting with her childhood, and it goes through her decision to banish her son, and also a bit after that and the aftermath of that. It also focuses a lot on feminist themes, including Kaikeyi's attempts to expand women's rights in the kingdom and gain more influence for herself as well. It also focuses a lot on her relationships with the people around her, including her brothers, her husband, the other wives of the husband, her sons, and her maidservant, and generally other people that she meets along the way. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the relationship to the Ramayana, because this is why I chose to read this novel for this project. So the novel does follow a lot of the similar beats to how Kaikeyi is presented in the traditional tellings of the Ramayana. So she is one of the most influential of the king's 3 wives, and she receives 2 boons from helping the king in a battle. And then originally when the king announces that Ram is going to be the heir to the throne, she's pleased, despite the fact that her biological son was originally the one who is supposed to be on the throne. However, in the Ramayana specifically, it is Kaikeyi's maid who tells her and influences her to try and put her own biological son on the throne instead of Rama. And this is because the maid tells Kaikeyi that she will lose her influence in the palace if another wife's son goes onto the throne. So Kaikeyi uses the 2 boons that she was granted earlier to exile Rama and put her own son on the throne. And then she is widely hated for this action. So many of these beats are still present in the novel Kaikeyi. However, the way that they're framed is different. So for one, I won't go too much into the reasons behind the actual decision, but there is kind of a different reason presented for her decision to exile Rama, and it is more of her own choice rather than something that her maid has influenced her to do. And in general, I think a lot of the author's intention behind this is she saw the figure of Kaikeyi and how at the beginning of the Ramayana, Kaikeyi is presented as, a good mother, an influential queen, and so on. And her characterization very quickly shifts to being evil and despised after this decision. So going into more about how someone who can be seen as good and influential in some ways can so quickly be despised is, I think, a big intention, and giving more agency behind that decision, and behind, imagining what else might have happened in these events is a big focus of the novel. So when we discussed the Ramayana in class, one of the big things that we talked about was the women's retellings of the Ramayana throughout history. And so that was part of the reason why I chose this novel in particular, because it is written by a woman and focuses on one of the women characters in the Ramayana. However, I think one major thing that sets us apart from the things that we talked about in class is oftentimes we discuss the retellings as told from Sita's perspective, or not told from her perspective, but focusing her voice and focusing her experiences more than in traditional tellings of the Ramayana. However, this, again, it's not a retelling because it does not tell the whole events of the epic, and also includes a lot of things that did not happen in the epic. But in kind of a trajectory of these woman-focused retellings of it, this time it focuses on the figure of Kaikeyi instead of someone like Sita. And I think this was a really interesting choice. I think it gave the author a bit more creative freedom in what type of story she was able to tell. And I think it was interesting that she chose someone who has a lot of power, and who is shown to have a lot of power in the original epic. And I think that allows the story to go in different places, and very interesting places. So I really appreciated that choice, and I found it interesting kind of in contrast or along with the lineage of women's retellings of the Ramayana. And so the other thing that I wanted to talk about is how this can be read in some ways as a diasporic retelling of the Ramayana. So the author is from the US, and I also noticed that this, in general, I've read a lot of American fantasy books throughout my life, and I think I can see how it fits within that fantasy canon, both in the structure and tone and a lot of the ideas presented. And I think it also currently fits with some trends in the fantasy world that I've noticed, namely the retelling of mythological stories. So there's a book a little while back that was Circe by Madeline Miller. It was really popular, and it's the retelling of the Greek myth of Circe. And I think this in large part popularized the retelling of different myths, especially told through the perspective of a woman character, and imagining how she might have thought about the events, and giving more perspective and kind of delving into the story from that perspective. So I can see Kaikeyi as a novel as kind of an extension of this trend in the fantasy world, and I find that, I guess, interesting from, again, the perspective of someone who's read a lot of fantasy books. The other thing that it includes, again, a lot of kind of feminist themes and goals, and a lot of this is expressed through the ideas and actions of the main character. And I think this is one thing that I found kind of jarring, especially at the beginning of the book, or not jarring, but it was just very clear to me that it's not, that the main character does not necessarily feel like she's trying to act like a woman of her time or something. So when I was at first reading it and trying to think about the historical implications of this, I think I felt like it was not a quote-unquote accurate portrayal of maybe how a woman might feel about the powers that she has in the world, and the ideas that she may hold. Not that every idea has been monolithic over time, but as a general representation of that. However, I don't think that was not really the goal of this novel. I think because it's more of a mythological story than a historical story, it can take more creative liberties in this sense. And again, if I kind of think of it as within the current fantasy canon, I think this is also a common thing where we have kind of historical set fantasy novels, but that aren't necessarily based on a particular time, more of drawing from different time periods or places, and not really on specific historical events or historical accuracies. And I think oftentimes within these novels, although they have a historical feel to them, the characters still feel pretty modern in their characterization or in their thoughts and actions. So I feel like once I contextualize it within kind of the broader fantasy genre, I saw how the way that the main character felt and acted, it's not that it's not historically accurate, it's more of a different way of telling a story and using an existing myth and existing work to kind of think about modern ideas of feminism and gender roles, and how those might have played out in kind of a distant time, but not like a specific historical context. So I thought that was interesting to think about, again, as someone who's read a lot of fantasy books, because I think it brings something new than like the typical fantasy genre, because it's oftentimes fantasy books or like the American fantasy books that I grew up reading a lot of would have more of a like European set time, or like, yeah, vibe to it, versus this is based on the Ramayana, but despite that like difference, it still follows a lot of the same kind of structures and characterizations that often come with this like fantasy genre that I've read a lot of. And speaking of fantasy, the other thing that I want to talk about is the role of fantasy within this book. So as I just said, it does kind of fit within the genre, so not just in the way that it uses fantasy, but also the way that it just tells the story, the type of writing, and general vibe of it. I noticed that it fits with a kind of pre-existing fantasy genre, and it's also very mythological and theological, so there are like gods present within this. Obviously there's Rama, and I think it has a kind of interesting, I found the portrayal of Rama really interesting because it was kind of like a little horrifying, because you have a mother who at some point realizes that her son, who's just like a guy, is also a god and has all this power and influence over people. And I think that was like really fascinating to read about and just like think about. I think that was a really interesting aspect of the book that I liked a lot. And also, Kaiki has a power to see and influence the binding plane, which is a place where she can see like these threads of connection between her and other people. And she can also influence these threads to like send suggestions to them or to strengthen her connection with other people. So I think this works really well with the aspect of the book that I was talking about that focuses on her personal connections with other people. And also you get to see the way that she gains her influence like within the palace, and the way that she influences things in kind of the broader kingdom and all of that. So I like this choice for her like magical power. I think it enhanced a lot of the aspects of the book that I personally enjoyed. So yeah, I think like obviously you can't really tell the or like have a reimagining of the Ramayana without including mythological things and theological things, so you're gonna kind of have aspects of fantasy no matter what. But I think it was like a cool additional choice to give the main character a additional power that's also, it's like not connected with the gods. There's a whole thing about that, about like fate and how she's kind of fated to do this whole time, and also on the outs of things and can't be like influenced by gods in the same way. Anyways, all of that was fun. So, okay, so now I'm just going to wrap up with my personal thoughts on this. I would say that it was very engaging. I like read it. It's, I think, 400 and something pages, so maybe on the longer side, but I read it like pretty quickly, and definitely like wanted to keep reading it. I think a lot of the parts that I liked were the personal connections and exploring like the idea of what happens when your son is a god, and how does that impact the people around you. It also just got really like sad towards the end. I did tear up, and yeah, I liked it. I think like because I've read a lot of books kind of that are different but following I guess like a similar story structure, I think it didn't feel quite as unique to me as the two other books that I'll talk about. And I think recently I've been like trying to read books that don't feel like things as much like things that I've already read. But that's not to say that this was like derivative or bad because of that. I think it's just I've read a lot of fantasy books, and I am trying to branch out a little and read different types of things. So I think it was a really good book, but maybe not in this current place and time as well suited to my desires for a book. But yeah, I would recommend it if the stuff that I talked about sounds interesting. Okay, hello. A bit of change in scenery here. I'm now on my beanbag, joined by Dunkelskog and this whale from IKEA, and I changed location because that's where I read the majority of our next book, The Devours, and also because I wanted to be comfy. But yes, some intro on The Devours from notes in my notebook. It was published, it's by Indra Das. It was published in 2015, and it is his debut novel. It was originally published by Penguin India in 2015, and then was later released in North America in 2016, and was published by also, I think, like a different publisher under Penguin, I guess. So anyways, as for a synopsis, it's a very strange novel. Just to get it out there at the beginning, it's okay, I'll get into the normal synopsis and then I'll tell more of my thoughts. But it's set in Kolkata, which is where Indra Das is from, and I believe still lives. Not that, I don't know, I don't need to be stalking this dude. But it follows a college history professor, Alok, who is the main character, and one night he's approached by a stranger who claims to be half werewolf, and Alok is very infatuated with the stranger, and agrees to transcribe these notebooks which the stranger has given him, which the stranger claims were originally written on like pieces of human flesh and are old histories, one of which is from a werewolf man and one is from a human woman. And the stranger asks Alok to transcribe these histories. Oh, and these were originally written during Shah Jahan's reign in Mughal India. So that's the synopsis. Already a weird synopsis. This is like all I knew about the book going into it, and so I chose it because I thought it like lined up well with the ideas or with what I was trying to do here of like fantasy books that are set in time periods that we've discussed, because it is like part of it is set in Mughal India. I will say it's probably the least relevant book specifically to the contents of the class. It deals with a lot of different themes, and I think it's a really great book, but I would say it's less like maybe specific to South Asia or specific to the things that we've talked about. Okay, so to talk about The Devourers, I wanted to first go into some of its main themes in the book. Again, these are not necessarily going to be super related to stuff that we talked about in class, but I don't know, I wanted to bring it up. I feel like this is really the heart of the book, and yeah, I just want to go through some of these themes and what it's about. So I've written some down. The first theme I have to discuss is queerness, ostracization. I can't say that. Sorry. And outcasts. And so I wanted to just go through each character. This will also provide just some background about the book anyways. So basically the synopsis is like each character is on the outs from human society in some way. So we have our werewolves, who are obviously on the outs from human society because they're werewolves. Also some background on the werewolves. They like eat people. They're kind of immortal. They get the stories from the people that they eat. There's more that you learn about them, but I guess I want to make it clear. They're very like powerful and kind of mythological. There's a lot of stuff around their souls and how they work. But yes, they're very different from humans, although they do have a form that appears like humans. So they might get mistaken for a human, but they're not supposed to fraternize with the humans at all, and they're supposed to feel like they're very different from the humans. So we have our werewolf Fenrir, and he's on the outs from things because he's obsessed with humanity and humans, and you can't do that as a werewolf. And then we have our French werewolf, who I could try and say the name of, but I don't want to, and he's in love with Fenrir. And as a werewolf, you're not supposed to be in love with anyone, so that's bad. And we have Sira, who's the human woman, and she is a prostitute. She's a woman and she's pregnant, which all bad things. Not actually, but you know, on the outs, you get it. And then we have the stranger, who's a half werewolf, so, you know, he's kind of gets a choice about if he wants to be more human or more werewolf, but either of the options might be difficult for him. And then we have Alok, our main character, who is queer, and he's also been cut off from his parents, and he doesn't have any friends, so he's very alone. He is a professor, so he like knows some other professors, or like one other professor, I think it's mentioned. But yes, he is very on the outs from things as well. And yeah, so that's the first theme, queerness, being an outcast. And I feel like these things are kind of linked as well, especially through Alok as a character, because it kind of seems like the main reason that he is accepting these narratives and like transcribing them in the first place is because he's already on the outs of things. Like, he doesn't really have anyone to talk to about it, and for them to be like, oh dude, like, what are you talking about? Werewolves don't exist. And so he doubts things as he's writing it, but he's also very intrigued, and I do feel like it makes a connection between the fact that he is a queer person, and like the fact that he's interested in these stories involving people on the outs of things, and also interested in the stranger, which kind of develops throughout the book as well. So I would say that's one of the first main themes. Okay, did the sun set? Maybe. But I'm still here talking about the Devourers. So on to the next thing. After talking about the major themes, I want to briefly touch on the role of fantasy within this novel, because that is the thing that is linking these stories together, along with their subject matter. So I feel like fantasy obviously plays a very important role. It's pretty central to this. However, it's not like a straight up like high fantasy novel, because it does also take place within the real world and kind of inserted within the real world. So it's more of a alternative history fantasy novel, if that makes sense. And I feel like the ways, like the choices that are made are very important for how this novel works. So I feel like one of the main things that's interesting to note is it is about werewolves, which is not necessarily a South Asian idea, which I feel like is the first kind of maybe confusing aspect of this book getting into it. But I think it comes from a place that like makes sense within the book, where the main werewolves that we follow are originally from Europe, which has the notion of werewolves. And there's a motif that repeats throughout this novel, where like the werewolves will kind of say that they might call themselves werewolves, might they themselves be werewolves, but kind of are other things depending on the culture they're in. So, for instance, a jinn or a raksha, as relevant to like Persian culture and Indian culture, and that also other of these werewolves that exist in those cultures would more take on the form of a typical jinn or a typical raksha, and that what they are is not necessarily a werewolf, but it's more of a shapeshifter, or something that holds a human form and some sort of secondary form. And this idea is not exclusive to the idea of a werewolf. So I think that's an interesting fantastical component and thing to note, where these are not, although they're mostly called werewolves, it's not really just the idea of a werewolf. It's kind of a nebulous creature that is almost created out of the culture that they're in, because they are like different across cultures, which I think like ties into, I talked about the big themes, but it ties into a kind of sub-theme that there are consistent mythologies across different places and across different cultures. And as I said, I think this book has a kind of universal feel to it, where it is set within a relatively like small geographical space, but it talks about things far wider than that. So I think that's the role that the fantasy plays in this, in kind of linking all of these mythologies together, is one role that the werewolves play. Another is that it enables the book to explore the themes that I talked about before, of being an outcast, being outside of society, and engaging in these debaucherous things such as, eating humans, and they have very like specific rituals that are kind of weird to read about, and I think all of that again goes into the feel of them being something other, and thus linking them to othered figures in human society. So that's the aspect of the fantasy in this book. So now I just want to touch on some of the historical aspects of this book, because that is one of the main reasons that I picked it up to read, since it deals with Mughal India for a lot of it. As I've said, I think the themes don't necessarily directly contend with the concept of history, or, with something specific to Mughal India or even India itself. However, the historical aspects are definitely still there. I think it's just interesting reading something that is set in that time period, because there'll be things that feel familiar, having like just learned about it in class and in some other classes and stuff, such as there's like, okay, it's set at the time when the Taj Mahal is being built, which is kind of funny. At first, I thought it was a bit out of place, like they kept mentioning that the Taj Mahal was being built, and I was like, okay, I get it. But I think I've rationalized its place in the book as part of a broader theme, of course. So I feel like by consistently mentioning something that's so historically significant and still holds such significance today, it places it in, or like juxtaposes these stories against something of such known significance as like the Taj Mahal that now has its own mythologies around it, like a whole history around it, you know? And I think it goes to another theme about what is important history to be told. Because we have the Taj Mahal on one hand, and on the other hand, we have the werewolves. And this, as I've said, it kind of symbolizes like the outcasts of society, or maybe like stories that wouldn't already be known or already be told. And I think that this interacts in an interesting and important way with like the fact that Alok, the main character, is a history professor, because he's discovering this new history that was unknown to him, but he's also doubting it, because it's not something that obviously is taught in schools, and it's not something that's widely known to human society. So it's a really interesting place for him to be in as a history professor, and I think it like puts important questions about what is history and what's the purpose of it, and also what are some things that have gotten left out of historical narratives, and how do we contend with that and include things that might have been left out. Obviously it does this through a fantastical lens, so it's not like werewolves are actually real, at least to my knowledge, but I do think it's a interesting way to do that. And again, I think by placing it like these narratives in a known historical and like historically significant time period, it emphasizes these questions, because you see this all happening at once, but one is a kind of outside of like main human society is the werewolves, and then the other thing is like meant to be historically significant, the construction of this magnificent building, you know, that still stands today, that still draws people today, that's still a symbol today. And there's other things like that that also kind of contend with the historical period as well, but I won't dive into those quite as deeply. But I do think that is a interesting aspect of the book as well. Okay, so finally, just briefly, I want to say some of my personal thoughts on it. I really love this book. I did tear up a bit at the end, and I was on a plane, so it was a little embarrassing. But yeah, I really loved it. I find it very interesting. It's very uniquely told, and I think the authorial voice is very compelling. I was more unsure of it about the beginning, but it definitely like got me in and made me want to figure out like what it had to say. And I think I was very pleased by the vibe of it, especially towards the end. So I would recommend this book. If anything I talked about just now sounded interesting to you, then you should read it as well. It's great. It's not very long. It's very interesting. It is a little weird, but I like weird books, so what can I say? Yeah, would recommend. Okay, so next up we have the last book, the one and only Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. So this is obviously a very famous book, so I kind of maybe cheated a little in terms of my book selection, because I knew this was going to be good and I knew it was going to be relevant to class. But yes, I loved it anyways, obviously. Yeah, so this is Salman Rushdie's second book ever. It was published in 1981, and it's very famous and very critically acclaimed. It's won many awards. I did not write down which ones it won, but big ones. And to give a bit of a synopsis for this book, it is an account of the main character Salim Sinai's life, and it is like in the book supposed to be written by Salim as a kind of autobiography of his life. And Salim was born on midnight, August 15th, 1947, right as India became an independent state. And so he claims that his birth inextricably tied him to the fate of the Indian state, and it also gave him magical powers of telepathy and also gave these powers to the other Midnight's children who were born on midnight, August 15th, 1947. And this kind of, his telepathy essentially enables him to tell this story because it both deals with his own life, but it also deals with the life of his grandfather and his mother and her siblings, and then just kind of other peripheral people who will pop up, and he's like able to know everything about their story or everything about their lives because of his telepathy. And so because it's pretty wide-spanning, it's not necessarily just about Salim in this book, and its timeline spans from 1915, which is when we get the story of his grandfather, Adam Aziz, and goes to 1978, right after Indira Gandhi's emergency period was over and after her party has been ousted from Congress. So one thing that I wanted to touch on about Midnight's Children is that this can be seen as a semi-autobiographical book, not only just because it's an autobiography from Salim Sinai, the main character, but also because Salim and Salman Rushdie share a lot of similarities, at least superficial similarities. So Rushdie was also born in 1947, not right on August 15th, I think it was sometime in June, but he was also born in Bombay, and also like both of their families share some superficial similarities, such as the fact that Rushdie's grandfather is also a doctor from Kashmir. So this does not necessarily mean that these people are the real people that they're based off of, but I do think it was an intentional jumping off point, and I think it was also intentionally done to bring forward the concept of autobiography to the book in a more real way. I kind of interpret this as Rushdie wanting to grapple with the notion of biography or autobiographies as a form of writing, but since he is a fiction writer and often incorporates areas of magical realism, which is also incorporated in this book, I think he maybe didn't want to do just a full autobiography. This is more speculation, it's less grounded, but I think it's intentional to bring forward areas of autobiography, and that also might be related to events that are personal to the author. And I think that's an important aspect of the book. Now I'm going to start talking about what I feel to be the major theme of the book. By the way, just for context, this book is pretty long. It's about 600 pages. There's so much to talk about in here. I will not be able to talk about everything, so I'm picking the things that feel interesting to me and also relevant to class. But yeah, there's just a lot to dissect in here in general. So I'm picking out kind of one major theme that I wanted to focus on, which I feel like is pretty important to the book and also will kind of lead us up to some other conversations that are more relevant to class. So anyways, the major theme that I picked out was an individual's place in history and kind of questioning this and grappling with this. And this is very prevalent throughout the book. So as I said in the synopsis, the main character Salim has this notion that his life is just inextricably linked with history and especially politics and stuff. And he feels that this happens both passively and actively. However, oftentimes this mostly happens passively. So for instance, there'll be a significant part of his life that's occurring at the same time as some significant historical event, and he'll draw some sort of parallel between the two of them and show how they're metaphorically linked, and thus they're kind of always supposed to happen at the same time. So it's this idea of fate, and it's also putting himself at the center of things, even though he's not directly affecting them, these things, and he's not necessarily a big part of them or being fully affected by them. And I think this goes to the idea where, people live through huge historical things all the time. And sometimes it does really affect your life in a lot of ways. And sometimes it's also just something that happens around you and affects things because how could it not? But you're not directly tied to it. And I think this is a challenging thing to reckon with in a lot of ways. And I see this book as like a version of reckoning with that, and a almost diluted way of reckoning with it by saying, I am at the center of this. Even though I did not have control over it, this was always meant to happen, and this is why it happened. So again, I think that goes back to the idea of this as reckoning with the notion of an autobiography, and also being, the time period of the author's, like Rushdie's life as well. And I think maybe, again, I'm not like speculating too much on his reasons for writing this book, but I think part of it could be maybe to explore those ideas, these things that happened in his life, and just the way that historical events occur while people are also living their lives and are doing like normal things. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of it, and it gives it kind of a different way of thinking about history and looking at it as it's occurring. And speaking of, I wanted to go into some of the history that this book explores. There's a lot of it. I'm not going to dive into everything, but briefly it starts with like the period of British colonization around World War I with the grandfather figure, and it goes through calls for independence and also partition, and kind of a debate about partition. Then there's the actual independence, and there's mentions of the violence that's happening in partition that happens because of that, but it's not like super delved into. There's also the language marches that are happening in Bombay. There's mentions of the 5-year plan. There's talks about the Communist Party and the election of 1957. Then there's the Sino-Indian War, as well as the Indo-Pakistani War. And this is around the period that the characters in the book go to Pakistan. So it occurs mostly in India and a lot in Bombay, but also in other places in India and in 2 different cities or I think different places in Pakistan. It also goes a decent amount into West Pakistan's invasion of East Pakistan, and then East Pakistan becoming Bangladesh. And it kind of wraps up with a period of Indira Gandhi's emergency rule and Sanjay's projects such as the Sum clearance and forced vasectomies. And then finally ends with the around 1978. So yeah, I really liked the way that all of these historical events were brought up. I felt like some of them were, I guess, given more importance within the narrative of the story. Like some of them the characters are more directly involved in or discuss more, or kind of repeated throughout more. But there's also a lot of things that happen and are mentioned like offhandedly, which I also found to be an important part of the book, where it would just mention like a name of a person or just a name of a thing that was happening, and you're kind of supposed to understand that was related to all of these things that are occurring while the events of the story are also unfolding. And again, I think it incorporates well into that idea of how to reckon with your life happening as all of this history is happening, when it's also just, the things that are happening in your life. And I also found it interesting from the perspective of having just taken this class, where this is a lot of the things that we talked about, but it's a very different perspective on it, as like from someone obviously fictional, but someone who's experiencing those things and living in this time. And also that a lot of people have different opinions, and I think that's expressed in a very realistic way. And not everyone is thinking like the right thing all the time, I guess. But that all, as everything is, it's going to be linked to different aspects of humanity. There's motivations of greed and motivations of family and religion, and that will color your perception of the things that are going on. So I think both like the characters' reactions to these events and also just the way that they're brought up and handled, I thought was a really good way of exploring this period of history. And I find it really interesting given the things that we were talking about in class. Speaking of things we were talking about in class, I also wanted to touch on how religion is brought up in Midnight's Children. So the author, Rushdie, is from a Muslim family, and so is Salim. I think both of their roots are in Kashmir, but then they're born in Bombay. But despite being from a Muslim family, Salim kind of brings in aspects of Hinduism and Buddhism to tell his story. He also relates himself to Ganesh and the Buddha, although the Buddha isn't necessarily the Buddha. It was just kind of like him as an old man. Anyways, I think it was interesting given what we talked about in class about how historically these religions have existed kind of together, and it's not necessarily that people wouldn't know if they're Muslim or Hindu. It was just that if you're a Muslim, you probably also knew a decent amount about Hinduism and would use that to maybe inform some areas of your view on the world, or to tell a story for narrative devices, to have metaphors and stuff like that. So I thought that was a really natural way of telling the story. I think it related to what we talked about in class about how these divisions have not always been as divided. And even as this is happening during and after partition, you still see how there are definitely tensions, and that was another thing that I wrote down. It definitely explores some the religious tensions both in India and Pakistan, and also religious fanaticism for various religions. I think especially for Muslims, since it does deal with the Muslim family. So it does deal with the tensions and fanaticism, but it also kind of shows how these things exist together and have existed together. So overall, I thought it was a very realistic portrayal of religion, and again, just as how the politics and history means different things to different characters, and they'll have different, opinions on it. Religion is also something that means different things to different characters. Some of them have a very fraught relationship with religion or with God. Some of them are very devoted and use that to kind of inform their actions, and is an important part of their character. So I thought that was interesting as well, showing the spectrum of how those things can exist. Okay, so now before I go into my personal thoughts, I'm going to touch on the role of magic in this book. So while it does deal with real history, and I've outlined the history that it deals with, I would say that the book is not really interested in realism, especially as a tone or vehicle to tell this story. Oftentimes things are happening that are grand and mythological, but also really absurd and funny. And I don't know, there's a lot of potty humor and stuff. It's an interesting mix, of things. But yeah, so we have the grand and mythological, and we have the absurd, and then we also have the real historical events and the sadness that happens, and trauma that happens through a lot of these real historical events. And I think this tone is very intentional. It seems to make sense given the voice of Salim, who's supposed to be the one, writing this autobiography, it feels like he is not fully grappled with all of the trauma of his life necessarily, and he is using this kind of absurd tone to tell a lot of terrible things. But I think that the tone is also intentional on part of the real author Rushdie, where again, he's not a nonfiction writer. He is a fiction writer and often deals with magical things. So I think writing about real events but not wanting to have a tone of realism then you kind of have to have a magical or absurd aspect to make that tone work for the story, or else you're just talking about real events in a way that's like kind of odd. Or at least that's how I feel about things. So yeah, I think the magic is necessary for the tone of the narrative, and then I also think that it supports the theme about like Salim's idea that he's at the center of all this history. You can't really have a character think that and then just entirely not be connected to things at all. So I think the fact that he, like, in this book is telepathic because he was born on midnight as India became independent, and also just the other absurd elements or magical elements allows you to make that gimmick or make that a central conceit of the book where this character believes he's at the center of things happening. And I think it's a more effective way of conveying that theme than if you were to try and just limit it to the realm of reality. Also about magic, like, I was worried because this isn't really necessarily a fantasy book, and I was worried that it wasn't going to have that much magic or something. It was going to be like sometimes magical realism is just it has like one gimmick, and that's like the magical aspect of it, and the rest is just completely normal. So I kind of thought that maybe like Salim having powers would be like the one gimmick, and then the rest would be completely normal. But the book is like, so much happens that would not actually happen. And I really love that. I think it kept it just very engaging as well. And again, gave it this sense of like mythology or epicness, but also silliness a lot of times. So I really liked how the magic kind of, I think it gives the author a lot of flexibility in like the type of story that he's able to tell. And I think he did a really good job with that story. So I'm glad that this is a magical realism book, and I think it like served that function just really well. So yeah. Okay, so to wrap up my personal thoughts on this book, I don't know if you could tell, but I really, really loved it. I read it pretty quickly because I decided kind of at the last minute that I wanted to read this instead of another book. And then I did not have that much time to read it, so I was a little pressed for time. But luckily I ended up super enjoying it, so it was not that much of an issue or anything. As I did with all of these books, I did tear up at the end. What can I say? But yeah, I think it's super, super unique, and also just deals with a lot of important things and a lot of important topics. And I think it made me think a lot about being a person who experiences things. That was very vague, but just in general, it's a book that makes you think. I also, like, every chapter is very unique and has kind of some concept in it that's interesting to think about. I think like the one thing I would recommend is maybe don't read this book as quickly as I did. I think it works a little better if you have time to sit and think like after the chapters. But yeah, I got it from, or it's in Fondy, if you can tell. I don't know. Oh yeah, it's in Fondy. That's where I got it. I will be returning it after this video, so if anyone wants to read this book, it's really good. And also there's like 2 shelves dedicated to Rushdie, so there's a lot of his other books and a lot of books talking about his books, and a lot to explore there. So yes, would recommend. Okay, so I know I've talked a lot already, but I just wanted to briefly wrap up some of the things that I've talked about and kind of relate some of the subject matter and themes of these books together. Specifically, I want to touch more on the role of fantasy within these books. Again, that is the thing, like tying these together, and that's something that I've talked about individually for each book, but I want to kind of think more broadly about how fantasy and magic and just generally breaking the laws of realism and stuff can help aid authors when talking about religious or mythological or historical subjects and times. So I think one thing that I noticed with all of these books, and I think I can see that in the fantasy genre, or just the technique of fantasy in general, is that I think whatever you decide to kind of focus on as your fantastical aspect really guides and can help push like what theme you want to focus on. So I think in Kaiki, the choice to use the kind of connections between people as a magical aspect of the book helps bring up the idea of Kaiki's personal connections with the people around her. So that's really emphasized within it, and I think it would be like not as well emphasized if you didn't have that magical aspect as well. And then within the Devourers, having the werewolves, I talked about how they're a representation of outcasts or people just on the outs of human society in general, and I think that helps with exploring ideas of queerness within the Devourers, as well as like history as told from a non-standard lens, as well as what it means to be human in general. So again, if it was just like a general historical document from Mughal India, I don't know if these themes would be as well expressed as if it were werewolves. And then with Midnight's Children, I think the fantasy reinforces a lot of the ideas of the main character and how he believes that he's at the center of history, and then it also just contributes to the tone and the general absurdity within the book as well. So with all of these, I think it shows how fantasy can be a really important tool for thinking about historical ideas, but also exploring different important themes within those historical ideas. So instead of just using something as a solely educational or informational as a historical basis, I think fiction and fantasy allows you to think about kind of the importance of these broader topics on specific periods and specific times. So I think it's a really important thing to have, and I really like fantasy books. I really loved reading all 3 of these books. I was glad that I chose each of them for this project, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video.